Hi, everybody, and welcome to our first webcast. We are the Wobbly Historians. Hi, everyone. John Cannon here with Phil Craig, Mark Zuehlke, and Mark Prue. And you would know us better as your guides and historians with Liberation Tours. We are Canada's premier battlefield tour company. And you can go and check us out, and particularly more about our individual bios. At the end of our webcast, we invite you to jump over to liberationtours.ca. This is the first of what we hope will be a series of webcasts where we're going to talk about the people and places and the events that we would chat about with you when you're on one of our battlefield tours, which we hope will happen soon. We can't visit the battlefield tours right now, so in its place, we thought we'd jump on this virtual bandwagon, and we would present some things for you here online that we hope you'll find interesting and informative. We're going to touch on the First and Second World War, of course, but we're also going to jump in on some things with medieval Britain, and also a little bit about the American Civil War, which is a brand new tour that we have coming up very soon. We're going to try and keep things light and informal. For those of you who have traveled with us on the battlefield tours in the past, you'll know that at the end of a day of visiting the battlefields and monuments, that we get into the hotel, and eventually everyone drifts down to the hotel lounge, and we put up our feet and we pour a glass and we talk about the amazing places and things that we've seen, and those are often some of the best chats we have, and we're going to try and use that exact same formula here. So without further delay, let's jump in on our first topic, and that's Market Garden. The anniversary of that is coming up in just a few days, but we're going to talk about a very particular aspect of Market Garden, and I'm going to kick it over to Phil.
Yes, and to those of you who have traveled with us in the past, a big heartfelt, warm hello. To those of you who will travel with us in the future, I look forward to meeting you. Yeah, so Market Garden's coming up, and we thought that, with this COVID lockdown situation going on, that, our experience, some of the knowledge we have some great historians, it should be put to use to give you something to look at and things to think about in terms of the way in which you may look to plan your future travel, hopefully with us. And so with Operation Market Garden coming up in a couple of weeks, we thought we should look at that. As you know, Canadians, apart from can loans, we're barely involved in that, but there is an operation at the end that's very important, Operation Berlin. And I only knew about Operation Berlin after we went to a military show, and somebody leaned over to the desk and looked at me. I must have had fear in my eyes because he was a big guy. Do you know Operation Berlin? And I recoiled and said, yeah, I think there are two that I know of. One is obviously the bombing of Berlin. I think there was an Operation Berlin in the Atlantic campaign. But this one, I didn't know. And 5 minutes later, I knew. And that's what we're gonna focus on today. So to get us to Arnhem, I think a quick recap of where the war's been at so far. So we've got D-Day, June 6, 44, and then after some very heavy fighting, 90 days later, as Montgomery predicted, and I say that for a reason. He predicted 90 days. Some writers, Carlo D'Este, for instance, the American historian, will quibble about the way in which he transitioned or changed the focus of the campaign. But he said 90 days. And 90 days later, the Allies were victorious in Normandy, and the Germans had suffered some very, very heavy losses. And I'm going to throw it over to Carl here to talk about just how serious those losses might have been.
Great, thank you, Phil. It's a pleasure to be here and to join you virtually at this difficult time. So yeah, as Phil mentioned, obviously the campaign in Normandy inflicts a blow on the German forces in the West that is unparalleled. Well, definitely paralleled from the East, but the fallbacks, the destruction of entire armies, divisions, has sent the defenses in the West reeling. Keep in mind it's balanced somewhat with the fact that these aren't by and large elite German troops. Nonetheless, the staggering losses, the pitiful amount of resupply, and the manpower shortages that are occurring means that, for all intents and purposes, Normandy is lost. Obviously, Phil's going to touch on the Falaise and the devastation there of two basic armies, and we'll layer in some imaging around that. But this really spells the ends for the Germans in the West, kind of, and we'll understand that how their skill training and their ability to cobble together units will serve them as they fall back farther to the north and to the west.
Yeah, that's great.
Check
that's
that
great.
error to the east. Liz, take that out.
And so when we get to Saint-Lambert-Sardive, one of the most poignant visits we have is crossing the bridge across the Dives River that was, wow, I mean, for the Canadians and Currie to hold was vital. For the Germans to get across was also vital. And the pain that their armies experienced in that cauldron cannot ever be, I think, overemphasized. And now we also get into, bringing into the Poles, because the Poles will be part of our story when we get to Arnhem, the battle that the Poles put up at Kuldehar to hold the Germans back, fighting with picks and shovels and fingernails to prevent the troops from escaping to their refuge, which was at that time seen as being the Seine River. So we're now around, let's say, August 22nd, I think. The Germans are falling back from Falaise. They cross the Seine. Paris falls, when was that? August 24th? Am I wrong there?
August 23rd.
August 23rd. And from here, there's a falling back, and an intentional, I think, falling back on behalf of the German army. Of course, they're being pressured. And I'm going to let Mark pick it up here and take us through the way in which the Germans defend themselves, the way in which they go back to the next strong point. And so I'm going to throw it over to you, Mark, to take us through the Channel ports, because we want to get to the point where the decision about whether the Scheldt is to be taken or whether we're going to continue with this thing that Monty comes up with called Operation Market Garden.
That's right. And of course, I think going to that, the first thing we got to look at is by September 1st, Montgomery and truly the Supreme Headquarters Commander, General Eisenhower, they both believe, and so is the attitude running right through the entire Allied army, that the Germans are done. They're on the run, and we're just going to keep pushing them along. Montgomery issues a directive called M519 to all of the 21st Army Group, including the Canadians. And he says in that the German army in the West has ceased to exist as a fighting formation. We will now complete the destruction of such of these forces as are still available to be destroyed. And that basically the end of the war is in sight. So what we're seeing is that classic thing of wars one after another. We've seen it in World War I, we've seen it in World War II at other times. The belief that the war will be over by Christmas. And
we saw it in the Civil War as well.
That's right. And you see it again and again and again. There's always this romantic love of the idea that the war will be over by Christmas. And Monty is very much in line with that. And this is where you start seeing Montgomery has been hatching and keeping in his back pocket this Operation Market Garden plan, the drive right through to Arnhem, get into the Ruhr Valley and hit the Germans so hard that they just give up. And that's really what he believes could happen. So he's got two issues, though. The biggest issue he's got is the Allies are still bringing all of their supplies in across the beaches in Normandy, and then Red Ball expressing them up to the front lines. but the front lines are moving ever further away from Normandy. And so, you've got further to go, further to go. You're using more of your resources just to get the resources forward. And in an ideal world, what you would have got was a very large port. That large port was Antwerp. And the British Army does get there quite soon, early on in September. They get there very quickly. But their orders were to 30th British Corps was just to take the city of Antwerp. Everyone kind of forgot that the major ports are actually not directly in Antwerp. They're across the Albert Turnout canals system. And they stop short of that. And also they're stopping short of that because Montgomery wants 30th Corps for Operation Market Garden. He hasn't got time to let them open up the whole Scheldt estuary because there's 72 miles separating Antwerp from the sea. And he's got to clear that in order to make Antwerp usable. So that's where we get to, where he's looking at, does he need Antwerp, or can he carry out Market Garden before the supply issue that he's dealing with overwhelms him and he runs out of gas, literally?
Can I jump in with a
Yes,
question
please
there,
do.
Mark? Because you've written an amazing book about the liberation of the Channel ports, and I'd like you to speak a little bit about that. During this time to liberate the ports, were they ever seen as being viable in terms of the supply network? I know there was an amazing figure that I think it was that for every gallon of fuel that was being delivered to the army at the front, by the time it had pushed up into northern France, we were using something like 5 gallons of fuel to deliver it.
Yes.
So can you speak a little bit more about the Channel ports and what that meant to the Allies?
So the Channel ports, Le Havre, Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk, Dieppe, were all considered very important. If they could get those open, particularly Montgomery was thinking, if he can get those ports, again, he doesn't need Antwerp. And even he finally says, if I can just have one port open, I don't need Antwerp. I can get this job of Market Garden done beforehand without getting into Antwerp. But the Canadians are fighting their way north along the coastline on the left flank of the entire Allied army, heading towards the important job of opening up these ports. It's not as easy as Montgomery anticipates. Hitler has designated all of the ports fortresses, and the garrisons are under orders to fight to the last man. These garrisons aren't made up of particularly brilliant troops, and Carl can talk to that in a bit. So they're not crack soldiers, but they're in very good fortifications. And one thing is they can just stay in place and fight. As long as they man their bunkers and put up a fight, they're going to cause a big delay in trying to take this thing. That port. So take a look at, for example, the port of Le Havre. It's the British who are assigned to 1st Canadian Army, 1st British Corps, that attack that port. In order to do so, they have to have all of the incredible siege equipment of the 70th British Division, Armored Division. That's the flails, the tanks that have fire. What are they called?
Crocodiles.
Wasps, crocodiles. Thank you. And all of that kind of the special switch bridge, scissor bridging equipment, all of that stuff. And so they realized you can only do one city at a time because you got to have all that equipment in order to do so. So opening up the ports is not going to happen quickly or in just a matter of weeks. And the British are also, the Canadians are facing in getting to the ports themselves, are coming up onto the Seine River initially. the Germans who were facing the Canadians were actually much better than a lot of the German troops that are fighting further to the east against Patton and other units. And they've got an advantage of terrain. The French coast is actually more rugged than the interior part of France in this area. The Seine is a wider river. There's a lot of forested areas. It's a much better defensive ground for the Germans. And so this is what makes the whole thing is almost impossible, that we're going to open up a port in time to support Market Garden, and we don't.
And so as they're going north, and obviously the very famous town of Dieppe, where the Canadians were involved in that the raid, which we won't get into today, but Dieppe wasn't big enough on its own.
It was very badly damaged. The Germans left it in a wreck, the port wrecked. Dieppe was kind of an anomaly because Hitler's orders that it be that establishing everything as fortresses would have applied to Dieppe, but the garrison at Dieppe bugged out just before the orders arrived. They hooked in with 15th British German Army that was retreating, and they went with them out. We didn't have to fight.
That's because they heard the Canadians were coming, obviously.
I think that was partly it. Also, they had an advantage. They had an opportunity to get away before it all arrived, and so they took that opportunity. But the Hitler's orders then arrive for the fortresses to be established, and now it's not going to. We're going to have to fight for each of the other ports. And interestingly, if you look at Dunkirk. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division encircled Dunkirk, engages in about 10 days of very heavy fighting, trying to get into Dunkirk. Can't succeed. 2nd Division is then under orders to head up towards Antwerp to start opening up the Scheldt Infantry Division, or Scheldt Estuary. And so they just rope it off, and Dunkirk remains in German hands right up until the final surrender at the end of World War II.
So when when was when I talk about the decision being made, I mean, obviously I can't talk about just Montgomery because he wasn't the supreme commander, but when was the decision made? When was the big push made? When was the recognition made? When was Montgomery given the go-ahead to attack Arnhem?
Montgomery was given the go-ahead about 10 days before Market Garden gets launched by Eisenhower.
So that's the 17th. So 10 days before that takes us to September the 7th. And what major ports had they liberated up until that time on the Channel coast?
They hadn't liberated any except Dieppe, and Dieppe wasn't usable. So by the time the decision's made by Monty that Operation Market Garden is to go ahead, Le Havre is liberated and open, but the port itself is very badly damaged, and it'll be weeks before it's usable. Dieppe is open, but again, the port is completely damaged, and it'll be October before their first ships start coming into there. Boulogne is in the process of being taken. It falls on the September the 21st. And at the same time, all of this action is happening with 1st British Corps and 3rd Canadian Infantry Division doing the fighting. 2nd Canadian Infantry Division and 4th Canadian Armored Division and the Polish Division have all been pushing northward into Belgium, and they're coming up onto the Scheldt Estuary to start trying to clear the estuary and open up Antwerp. 2nd Division goes into Antwerp itself and engages what they call the streetcar war, where actually literally the soldiers got on streetcars and went to the front each day and then went back into the back. So 1st Canadian Army is extremely strung out at this point. Its lines run all the way from Le Havre in France through Belgium to Antwerp in a long arcing circle with the Scheldt Estuary at the base. And they can't get to the south bank of the Scheldt estuary because the Germans have established a very strong holding position there that becomes known as the Breskens Pocket. And so the Scheldt estuary battle's underway, even as we're still trying to clear the channel ports. So you got two battles going on in concert, which leaves the 1st Canadian Army extremely strung out. And the other thing is, and this is why I called the channel ports the Cinderella campaign, is 1st Canadian Army is at the bottom of the Allied supply chain. It gets what's left over after the British Army getting ready for Market Garden and the American Army pushing hard towards Germany have something left. It's sent to us. And so this is the kind of situation we're in. And it might be a good time to pop over to Carl and get an update on where the Germans are at this point.
Sure, thank you, Mark. So just to touch on Antwerp, what's interesting is, so it is held by remnants of the 15th Army, as well as those German forces streaming back, to the north and to the east. Again, as Mark iterated, that they're, these aren't top of the line troops, they're fortress troops, stomach and leg troops, they call them, Bauch und Binden troops in German. But what an interesting fact is, Germany at this time is starting to plan for the Ardennes offensive battle, the offensive in the Ardennes forest. So the 15th Army is deprived of reinforcements, supply, materiel. And I'm wondering how much or how little that was known in the Supreme Allied Command, because I don't think it would have been as a protracted battle, given the dearth of supply that the situation was. Yeah. So again, you've got these isolated pockets in the north in Antwerp, but as Mark said, the ratio of a defender to an attacker always favors the defender, and they probably realize that in short order.
You use an interesting term there that one often hears in discussions about advances and retreats. You use the word streaming back as opposed to falling back. Is there in your mind, is there a difference?
There is, and I think I would add a third term into that, into a delaying. So there'd be a streaming where you would have en masse, and you'd be troops retreating and falling back. You would have the delaying actions, which a lot of what I've read, depending on the quality of the unit, the intensity of the battle, the tenacity of the local commander, they would fight delaying actions, which would allow more troops to escape and get out. And that's exactly what happened to a certain degree in Falaise, keeping the ford open, and over the Dives River to allow troops to get out. So there's streaming, delaying, and then just kind of falling back in short order in a military fashion, which is the goal.
But that's precisely why I asked about the word streaming, because it says to me, in my non-educated mind, that there is no plan, there's no organization, whereas falling back into another defensive position speaks more highly of the intelligence of command and the difficulty of the troops that are moving into that area, in particular the Allied troops, to overcome the new obstacles that are being put in their place.
Yeah, we see that very clearly at the Foray de Lalande on the south bank of the Seine. When the Canadians, that's where it's a classic example of what Carl was saying about delaying. The Germans put in some very good troops in that particular spot because they knew that forest, and having been there, it's an incredibly dense forest. They knew they could hold the Canadians up for quite a while there, and they do for about 5 days. They hold them in place, and meanwhile, they're pouring troops across the bridges onto the other side, and some thousands of Germans get away again. So it worked well.
And Mark, as you talk about the Seine, and probably this is going to go back to Carl. It's one thing to get troops across the river in improvised boats and whatever, but it's another thing to get armor across a river.
Yes.
So, Carl, do you want to throw anything in here? And I mean, we know where you come from in terms of your expertise on German strategies, etc. But these crossings or these falling back positions are going to cause great difficulty because they can't get a lot of armor back with them, right?
You're right, and in large cases that would be lost. The amount of material left on the battlefield, lack of petrol, just abandoned because they couldn't cross, certainly was the situation. To the extent possible, they could have, planned this. They knew they would be falling back, retreating, fighting, delaying actions, so they could choose the routes to the extent possible in terms of Allied air cover and things like that. But a lot of material would have been lost on the field for sure. But in certain places, the Seine, very large, as Mark said, very wide, fast flowing. So efforts would have been taken in advance. And considering the Germans had been there for the better part of 4 years and a bit, they're probably a little more familiar with the terrain, maybe intimately so in certain areas and certain commanders that they would have very good knowledge of where and when to go.
But were they thinking they were ever going to be this far back, close to Paris, in terms of having to defend these areas? And I was also, as you were speaking, thinking about the losses they're now suffering on the Eastern Front.
Great point, and I should have layered that in because 2 weeks after D-Day, you've got Operation Bagration, which is a massive, offensive on the Eastern Front. Obviously, designed to coincide with the final opening of the front on the west. So the attrition is now exponentially greater on German forces. To your original question around, do you think they would find them or be surprised that they found themselves so close to Paris, in such a rapid, withdrawal through France? I think some of them, knew the writing was on the wall very quickly. Once they couldn't hold them on the beaches, then it very much became a war of what can we resume, get closer to the borders of Germany, and save some semblance of a negotiated peace or, a shred of whatever was left of Germany, pre-war.
So basically, once Caen fell and once the Americans broke through in the south, this is the new framework of thinking in the German forces. It is, not Hitler, but the German forces.
No, and not even a lot of the senior commanders. The senior generals were still probably delusional. But I think the final point I would make is that you've got a lot of units. What always amazed me in reading this is you've still got a large amount of units being shifted from east and west. You've got the Italian front as well. The amount of men and equipment that are still being moved around within the European theater of operations, astounded me. So as we'll see later on in our discussion on Arnhem, you've got a lot of experienced units from the Eastern Front now in Normandy. I'm not going to say they're resigned to their fate, but these are hardened, tough warriors, that were used in stiffening of other units. And they just did the job. They weren't worried about retreating or dying or, not to put too much drama in it. They were just realizing this is the task at hand. And I think the old adage goes, is kind of comical here. The three things that are sure in life: death, taxes, and a German counterattack. So not only are they retreating and delaying, they're also looking for opportunities to counterattack and to regain lost ground, which seems asinine at this point, but that's very much the German doctrine at the time.
Yeah.
Yes, and we see that actually in the Channel ports as well as even when at Boulogne, we're fighting our way through. The Germans lose a bunch of major fortified areas, and instead of just falling back into their next set of bunkers, what do? They launch a completely impossible counterattack and get shredded. So that speeds the fall of the garrison, but they're reacting to the doctrine that they've been taught to do, and they still cause a lot of chaos for the Canadians in that attack. We see it again in the Foray de Lalande, particularly every time the Canadian and Carl's point about knowing the ground is a good one there, because the Canadians were heading into Foray de Lalande and thinking it was just a little force. They were just going to roll right through, get to the river. They didn't anticipate the fight that they were going to have. And some of that's just poor intelligence, but it's also the speed with which we started to advance once we got out of Falaise. Everyone's moving so quickly, that kind of advanced reconnaissance isn't happening because you're thinking about doing the reconnaissance and you've already taken the place. So, you know, and that's what they started to think. And that's why everyone's getting heady and everyone's saying, oh, the Germans are finished.
Yeah, and I think we'll see that when we get into our discussions about Blockbuster in early 45. You know, how the terrain, you know, is all important. Terrain, weather, all the other things. So just to simplify where we're at now, we're 4 months after D-Day. The Germans have been falling back, defensive position after defensive position. And we've reached a point where a decision has been made by Allied High Command to, rather than take the Scheldt and make Antwerp into a usable port, we're now in a situation where Montgomery has gone to Eisenhower and has said, look, if we can go from Eindhoven 70 kilometers north, cross the Nieder Rhine, take Arnhem, do a right hook into Germany, we can capture the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany, and the war. Who was it used the term Christmas? I think it was.
Yeah, it'll be over by Christmas.
It'll be over by Christmas.
Yes.
All right, gentlemen. Right here is a good time to say it's time for the wobbly historians to take a refill break.
Okay, there's a lot of historians, particularly in the 60s and 70s, American general historians said that Montgomery, you know, basically bullied Eisenhower into going along with Operation Market Garden. And that's not true, I don't think, because Eisenhower in his memoirs himself said that he not only endorsed the operation, he embraced it, and he would do so again, even knowing that it failed. That he and Monty agreed on taking a calculated risk that they would be able to get through to Arnhem. They both knew there was the potential of failure, but they thought it was a worthwhile gamble. And that should take us to Phil and how Arnhem, the whole Market Garden, rolls out.
Yeah. So you'll be looking now at a map, and I think the first thing to recognize is that, you know, to look at that map in early September, you can see that it's very clear that we're behind enemy lines. We're a long way in Arnhem behind enemy lines, 80 kilometers. And I think that's key to understanding what happens at Arnhem. And I don't want to get into a big thing because I want to spend more time with the engineers at Driel. But very briefly, you know, the battles that took place along the 80-mile stretch of highway coming from Eindhoven through Nijmegen, they start on September the 17th, and basically they end 8 days later, September the 25th. The Canadian Army wasn't involved in this operation, apart from, as I said earlier, a couple of can-lone officers. Maybe couple is wrong, but, you know, hardly any involvement. They weren't involved until September the 25th, when our engineers ferried the survivors of the Arnhem battle back across the Rhine. So Montgomery's idea is to force an entry into Germany over the lower Rhine. The idea is to seize bridges across the Meuse, the Waal, the lower Rhine, because Montgomery figures that crossing the lower Rhine would, as I said earlier, allow the Allies to encircle Germany's industrial heartland. In the Ruhr, from the north, the Americans are coming up from the south. It would deprive the enemy of munitions, bring about the collapse of the German army in the west, and end the war by Christmas. There we have that wonderful phrase again. And if they did this, then they wouldn't have to clear the Scheldt. American generals wanted to take the war to Germany slightly differently, but Eisenhower ruled in Monty's favor, and so the operation was on. And the ultimate objective is going to be this bridge. Between this bridge and the starting point, 80 kilometers south of Arnhem, there are 5 major water obstacles and bridges that have to be secured before you get to this bridge. The idea was to seize each one using airborne forces who would secure the bridges, hold them as a rapid advance by armored units followed up, and then attack into northern Germany. The problem was that each part of the plan had to succeed for the entire operation to succeed. And there were 2 parts to the plan. There was Market, which would provide for the dropping of the airborne troops onto the bridge locations and into Arnhem, and Garden, the ground portion, which provided for tanks and infantry, 30 Corps to charge up Highway 69, later nicknamed Hell's Highway. So, what's the problem here? Well, Highway 69 is 2 lanes wide. It's generally raised above the surrounding flat terrain of polder or ground, which is too soft to support tactical vehicles, armored vehicles. So the armor was pretty much restricted to the road. Maneuver was severely restricted. It was later envisaged the airborne would consolidate the bridges, the armor would drive north. It was expected that it would take 4 days for the airborne troops dropped at Arnhem to be relieved. 4 days. Now, 4 days is a long time for an airborne force to fight unsupported. The paratroops lack adequate anti-tank weapons. They lack tanks, although some light armor was delivered by glider. But the plan overall was for 34,000 and a half, I think, men to be delivered by parachute and glider, with supporting air interdiction where possible, where necessary. They had some information from the friendly Dutch sources that there were German reinforcements moving into the area. I think if you go back to the movie, they were sort of overlooked intentionally. The drive was on. It was going to happen. Sunday, the 17th September 44, Operation Market Garden opens, and there was Allied success all around. All the troops arrived on their drop zones. Few incidents except at Arnhem. The Germans, as they retreated towards Germany, as their supply lines had shortened, instead of lightly defended town, the British encountered much more. Carl can speak to the forces that were there, but they were pretty heavy, and the drop zones were 11 kilometers from the signal thing that they wanted to capture, the bridge. They were 11 kilometers away from their objective. And there's a reason for that. They needed to be 11 kilometers away because that's where the high ground was. And they felt for defensive reasons that they needed to capture the high ground so that they could hold it against any incursions being made by the Germans. You'll recall that the same thing happened in Normandy. When north of the D-Day perimeter, they took the high ground to hold it against incursions from the north by German forces. Basically, what we end up with now is British forces paratrooping in, coming in by glider. Problem number one is that they don't have enough gliders, and so they recognize they're going to have to do this in several drops. So it's going to take at least 2 days to get all the forces on the ground. And in England, you then have the weather close in, fog, and so you can't get all the forces on the ground that you had anticipated having there, and so we have a problem, and so slowly we have this creep back, where the objectives are not being taken in the fashion that we had anticipated. And as the 30 Corps is advancing up from the south, they get to Nijmegen, they get to the bridge at Nijmegen, and it was decided there that they would hold the tanks from crossing the bridge until the bridge was made secure. And that's a fateful error. And I think that seals it for the troops in Arnhem. And so to try and get through Arnhem as quickly as possible, by day 4, things are getting difficult. They learned that help is not on the way. By the afternoon of day 4, I think that's the 21st, we understand, or they understand, that the British positions around the north end of the Arnhem Bridge have weakened considerably. Casualties were high, ammunition's low. A truce is declared to take the wounded out, including Lieutenant Colonel Frost, who goes into captivity. By the end of September the 21st, we're now 4 days into Market Garden. The rest of the division is basically trapped in a small pocket to the west of the bridge. And so now this is where we get to the reason why we're here talking about this, Canada and Canadian engineers.
Bill, if I could just layer in very quickly to provide a bit of context. Just a couple of the reasons, why it kind of started off great and then went south. And there's just a few points that I noticed as we were, preparing for this. So as we mentioned, a stream of all types of units moving from the north and east. Some very good, as Mark and you alluded to, with strong leadership. Key to that leadership, and I think this is important because we're talking about an airborne landing, is you've got probably 4 of the most brilliant German paratrooper leaders in the whole Wehrmacht.
Yeah.
You've got von der Heydt, Student, Meindl, and not Fallschirmjäger, but you've got Model, brilliant tactician in the defense. Yeah. So it's really an unfortunate situation that these, for the Allies, that these 4 leaders are in this area because their focus is on these tactics. The other thing I want to mention, and you touched on it, Phil, is the proximity to Germany. So reinforcements have a much shorter way to come. Supplies have a much shorter way to come, notwithstanding the challenges with the buildup for the Ardennes offensive. It's very quick to supply those units. And what I've always noticed as a quasi-military guy and somebody who served and kind of read history as well, to me, I think one of the fundamental issues is the Allies, as they're chasing the Germans north and to the east, they pause at the Meuse-Escaut Canal, and that kind of forms the front line. That pause, and anyone who's ever been in the military or read knows that when you break contact with the enemy, you give them a time to refit, replenish, regroup, and that's exactly what the Germans do. Some of the memoirs they talk about, we can't believe the Allies stopped. And that was one of those issues where it just gave them that breathing time, space to maneuver. So I just wanted to layer in a couple of those points because that's really what starts to solidify the end for this operation.
Great. I think we're now going to be looking at a picture of the monument at Driel. We're on the south side of the Rhine. We get to the point with Market Garden where I think it was on the evening of the 24th that the decision was finally made that the American attempts to break up over what is known as the John Frost Bridge had been unsuccessful. British troops there had been pushed back into Oosterbeek. We'd had the truce. Frost had gone into captivity. And so the British airborne troops are gradually coalescing around the Hartenstein Hotel. That's their headquarters. That's on the north side of the river. There had been I'd mentioned earlier the lack of air transport. There had been a drop made that brought the Poles into the battle is the same Poles we talked about earlier back at Kudihar in the Falaise Gap battle. And they're dropped into Driel on the south side of the river. And so basically you end up with a situation where the main bridge over which we wanted the armor to go had not been captured. And this British paratroop formations, they're being pushed back, and we get to, I think it's day 6 when finally it's decided that we have to evacuate what's left. I'll go through the numbers at the end of the discussion about, how many were dropped, how many got out. But now we get to where we're at. So Horrocks, who is the British commander, issues evacuation orders. And the 23rd Field Company Royal Canadian Engineers arrive in Driel with 36 storm boats. And I think we can now show you some pictures of storm boats and possibly even video. They're constructed of plywood. They weigh about 900 pounds. They're 6.5 feet wide, 20 feet long. Each could carry a jeep or a 6-pound gun or 12 to 16 soldiers. The bow and the stern, as you can see there, are square, and a narrow bench runs along each side. I think actually on Ron's recreated that the benching isn't that obvious. There was more of that rimming down along the boats they used in this operation. And each boat is powered with a 50 Evinrude, and you can see one on the back of Ron Stevenson's recreation there. 50 horsepower Evinrude outboard motor. And this outboard motor makes all the difference in Operation Berlin. Because prior to the Canadians coming up here to the Rhine, 2 British companies, engineer companies, were also trying to extract the paratroops. But they didn't have motors, and so they had to paddle instead. And the current in the Rhine here is quite strong. So now the Canadians are called in. And so when they arrive at 7:15 in the evening, that's 1915, it's pitch black. And there's a heavy rain. And so you need to put yourself on the ground here. And so we're looking into a darkening skies. We know that there's a river in front of us, and on the other side of that river, we have our own allied forces who are fighting to survive. There's a bitter wind blowing. German flares from Arnhem, and Arnhem being over to our right, Oosterbeek not so far to our right, but more to the left of them. German flares are arcing into the sky. And artillery begins shelling this road that we Canadians are on. Because we have been told to come here, to take the boats off the trucks, to move them to the Rhine, to get the men across the river out. And so as the Canadian troops get here, 16 men tackle each boat. They unload them from the transport trucks. They drag them across the rough, muddy ground to the river. There's machine gun fire zipping around everywhere. A large factory just over to our left is burning at Hivador. And that illuminates this entire area, which makes it more difficult for us because it increases the chances of the Germans being able to see us and to be able to fire on us. A single boat, a single storm boat, is sent across the river. The crossing takes about 4 minutes and it comes back. No survivors can be found on the other side, none. Now, The Germans have added mortar fire to the mix, and so both shorelines are becoming increasingly dangerous places to be. A second boat is launched, and the engineers on the south side here now, well, they just wait. And an hour passes. It's close to midnight, and hope starts to fade, when suddenly the helm of the second storm boat appears out of the darkness. It's crammed with wounded soldiers, mostly stretcher cases. And that's why the boat was so long in returning. Loading on the other side had taken so much longer because of the serious nature of the injuries. Lacking enough stretchers, greatcoats, other clothing become improvised litters. Dry clothing and spare greatcoats provide warmth for men who were, and I quote our diaries, in desperate need of cover from the elements. Remember, it's freezing and it's raining. But now, the Canadian engineers on this side of the river know there are men on the other side who desperately need help. The offloading of the wounded is complete from that one storm boat. The entire force of 36 storm boats push off northwards into the dark. The engineers labor ceaselessly throughout the early hours of the 25th and 26th. Enemy fire takes its toll. Several boats are so riddled with fire they have to be abandoned. The outboard motors are failing because of the rain. The operation starts to fall into chaos. Boats come and go as fast as they can. On the far shore, where the enemy are closing in on them, men panic and storm the boats. Many have to be beaten off with or threatened to avoid swamping the boats. Daylight comes and exposes the boats to German fire. Machine guns start raking the exposed targets. The rescue attempt starts to run out of steam. And then two operational boats make a last desperate attempt. As one approaches a crowd of frantic men, they start piling on board. The boat sinks under their weight, which sobers the paratroops up. They help the paratroops lift the boat out of the water, prepare it for launching, but then they can't get the waterlogged motor to start, so the men start to paddle using their rifle butts. The second storm boat is packed with men. Its bow is inches above the waterline. Full power from the 50 horsepower engine is not possible because it would create a wash that would sink them, and so it putters along as if on a holiday outing. Bullets kick up, water sprouts alongside, but amazingly, none hits home until a sniper round slams into a young paratrooper and another slams into a young Canadian engineer. And as the boat touches down on the South Shore and everyone piles out, they are the only two left, the dead soldier and the engineer. And Canadian, or Operation Berlin, the evacuation of the survivors of Market Garden is over. And 2,800 men are saved. I think it's a fabulous story. There's we don't on our tours often get a chance to talk about the engineers. They are the backbone of the Army. But their heroism often goes, I mean, I know when we're in Italy, we talk about various bridges that were built under fire, and I think we try to emphasize as much as we can what they've done. But there are, I think, a couple of, I don't want to use the word important, but maybe fascinating elements that come into play in this story. And so where we see this monument, it's not this road that that we were bringing the rescue troops back down. It's or I should say, it's not this road that's the most important road. If we had thought about it, if planning had thought about this, because this road was gravel, but to our left, there's another road. This is the road that goes from Driel to Havidorp. And in between Driel on the south side and Havidorp on the north side is a ferry. That road is paved, and there's a ferry there. So the important thing about the road being paved is that on paved roads, you can move your armor quickly. So as the British forces in Arnhem are being pushed back, the realization is made that maybe here at Driel is the problem to the forces, because there's a second way around what's become known as the Frost Bridge. The Americans didn't have to continue their drive to that bridge to get into Arnhem. They could have come here, where the ferry traversed was shallow. At some time it had been a ford, and a Bailey bridge could have been thrown across here quickly. And it's possible that armor could have crossed the Rhine, not on the Frost Bridge, but here at Driel, and Market Garden then would have actually succeeded. And so Driel, you have two amazing stories. First and foremost, from our perspective, the Canadian engineers evacuating 2,800 survivors under heavy fire, losing, again, I can only use the word amazing, one man. And secondly, 30 Corps could have crossed here and not in Arnhem. And to back that up, Lieutenant Colonel Myers, Chief Engineer to Major General Urquhart, Commander 1st Airborne, said after the war, the divisional staff, including myself, I freely admit, of course, with an English accent, did not realize how important the ferry crossing would become. Yeah, but it wasn't to be, because Market Garden was a disaster. I think 1,500 died, over 6,000 were taken prisoner. And so we come back to the dubbing of the bridge by Cornelius Ryan, A Bridge Too Far. Was that an ill-conceived dubbing? Well, I'm going to go back to our historians and get their opinions, but I want to speak for myself to say that I believe that because they had not considered the ferry crossing, that this was an ill-conceived operation that was doomed from the start. And I believe that it is left up there as a symbol of British guts. I think there's been an amazing amount of mythologizing after the war. I think the Brits want to see it as a heroic failure, because no one really wanted to tell their families that the boys had died for nothing. So I throw it back to my team.
Yeah, I think actually your points are really good. It's interesting if the Ford had come into the planning in the initial stage, and you consider where we landed the airborne troops there.
Yeah.
Did they have to go for the bridge, or should they have just secured the Ford area and turned it into a bastion and waited there for the 30th Corps to come through? Had that happened, would they have been better positioned to have repelled the German counterattacks that would have come their way? That's the big question, which we'll
Or
toss over to
or
Carl.
could you throw a feint in towards the main bridge, knowing
Yeah.
that you had better communications, because your drop zones now are like 5 kilometers closer, so your communication's
Mhm.
going to work. Your distancing is a lot.
Yeah, it's an interesting
So,
question. Carl.
it's interesting, but doesn't hold a lot of wine water to me. Um, just no, but I understand what you're saying, and a couple of points. Again, I go back to my the German familiarity with the terrain, with the region. I would find it hard to believe as a local commander, even one that had been put there in a hasty position, not to realize all my potential threats. And if the ford was such a strategic position that it was easily passable by armor and large masses of troops, that I wouldn't somehow have defended it, mined it, pre-sighted it, with any of the artillery I had in my position. That's supposition on my part. I don't know what the German response was, but I don't think if it was such a beautiful secret that the Allies failed to exploit, that the Germans would have missed it as well. I see you got your hand up there, Phil. But
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
just want to add, something to that, because I think it. Yeah, I mean, you refer to, and when we visit the Rhine, you can see it's not, it's a big body of water.
Yeah.
The owner of the Driel-Heverdorp ferry sank it a couple of weeks. Actually, did he do it before Market Garden or during Market Garden? He sank his ferry
I think he
because he
did
didn't
it.
want the Germans
I think he did it before,
Yeah.
quite a while before.
And the other point I would make is, and this is where I'm researching. We're always learning. I think that's the beauty of what we do. Understanding some of the counterattacks that were happening at the bridge. So following some of those, I guess famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, how the Germans were trying to recapture the northern side of the bridge, where Frost's men were in all the houses and themselves fortified in. So the Germans were already on the south side of the bridge
Yeah.
in what I would say a relatively decent force, maybe a reconnaissance in force, but they certainly had some decent weapons. So I'm not sure just by the Americans reaching the south would have mitigated a lot of the gaps in the Arnhem Plan. And the final point I'll make, as you alluded to, Mark, Monty came up with the plan. It was approved 10 days prior, and boom, off you go. You add another 2 or 3 weeks into that planning, maybe this is a more resilient, sound plan that takes advantage of some of those geographical opportunities or strategic points.
Mhm. Yeah, and
But
that's a
that,
good point. Actually,
yeah.
is we always have to remember that Market Garden was, in a sense, cobbled together, and we know in retrospect now that Ultra had alerted Monty to the presence of the German SS units that were there. So there was also some willful neglect, really, and just, I don't want that information, so I won't own it.
Yeah, and I think that was Phil that made the point earlier about, it's not that they underestimated German strength. They knew German strength. But again, I think it was that hubris to think that this is a defeated force. Even those 2 units you speak about, Mark, the 9th and the 10th SS, veterans of the Eastern Front, armored divisions only in name, nothing more than, heavily armored Kampfgruppen. But still, these represented a formidable force. Panther tanks, Tiger tanks, all means of anti-aircraft guns, which really spelt the end for a lightly armed airborne force relying on a 30 Corps coming up the road.
Yeah, and that goes, if you look at the same time as Market Garden's playing out, the 1st Canadian Army is learning as well how quickly the Germans can reorganize when the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division comes up against a camp group that rolls down on them, which is just hurriedly thrown together on the fly, but is a good effective block to their attempt to get into the Beveland Peninsula and open up the Scheldt Estuary. So
that's a great point, because what the units you're seeing in Arnhem in the beginning, these are NCO schools. These are sailors that have no ships. These are, basically, I'm not going to say they're the dregs of the army, but these aren't infanteers. These aren't grenadiers. They have basic infantry training. So yeah, the German ability to cobble together, even at this stage of the war, with Volksgrenadier, old age, third line troops, I think, is their last kick and their last victory of the war, for sure.
Yeah, plus the British ability to have drop zones that are far away and crystal sets that can be listened to by the Germans. And yeah, it all gets very mucky and very difficult very quickly. 8 days of bravery, though, and although
no doubt.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Phil, when you say that the Market Garden has been both by the Americans and by the Americans as well. I've read that of all of the campaigns in World War II, Market Garden is the most written about. There's more books that have been put out. You look at the board game industry. There's multiple versions of board games about it. So has captured this imagination of generations.
But there is something, and even General Simmons referred to this shoulder of land that we had up there into Nijmegen as being, from his perspective. And we'll take a look at this when we go forward into Blockbuster and beyond. He felt that that even though they didn't get into the bridge, didn't get to move through Arnhem, make the right hook, that what they captured was, in terms of progress, I think I'm right in saying Simmons saw this as being the most valuable piece of land, which the Canadians are moved into when the Americans are moving back down south to defend against the Germans in the breakout.
Yeah, well, that's right. Nijmegen is critical to the operations that are going to come in January and February and March of 1945, because it's the jumping off point for First Canadian Army's push into the Rhineland.
Yeah, and yet it still takes them a long time to actually take Arnhem.
Mm-hmm.
They have to go to the right and then to the north and come back in to the left, right? So it takes a long time.
It's ultimately 4th Canadian Armored Division that takes it.
So
5th Canadian Armored Division, actually.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it does. This is looking back at it. It does appear to be a tough nut, especially geographically. There are bridges and I forget how far it was that Simmons said when we get into next year, we'll discuss this, how far north he had to go before he could find a way to get across the river system and come back down into Arnhem. But that's for future discussion.
That's right.
Very good. So on that note, I think we'll call it a day, and we'll say we hope that you enjoyed our first webcast. If you liked it, then we hope that you'll hit the thumbs up button down below. And perhaps you might even be interested in hitting the subscribe button so that the next time that we post some interesting content, you'll be alerted to it. The questions and comments, we'll leave those open for a few days. So post those messages down below and we'll do our best to get back to you. So again, as Phil said originally at the beginning, for those of you who have been with us on a tour in the past, we're glad you've popped by. Good to see you. And for those of you who are booked with us on an upcoming tour, we do look forward to being with you on the battlefields very soon. And for those of you who are new to Liberation Tours, we would say pop over now to our website at liberationtours.ca. We've got the battlefield tours. We've got some cultural tours. You can see our bios. You can see detailed itineraries, including hotels and everything else. And in particular, we would say, check out the testimonials page, and you'll get some feedback from past travelers, and they can tell you all about the great experience that they've had with us. So that's all for now from the Wobbly Historians. Thanks for watching.